G'day folks, welcome to this review of Atlantic War, published by SPI in 1978. This is a 43-year-old monster war game. It contains about 2,000 counters, 5 maps, covers the Normandy campaign over the course of 104 turns, running until the 1st of July. So from the 6th of June through to the 1st of July. The map cuts off at Coutances, pretty much just south of Saint-Lô and south of Caen. So it doesn't go right down the coast to Avranches and Falaise and so forth. Keep in mind this is the SPI edition. The more recent Decision Games redesign of this effectively doubles the map depth, and I believe does go down that south. But keep in mind that is a heavy redesign of the system, which started with this. The design had this in mind, but almost completely rewrote the rules and the system. So it has a similar scale and sort of scope, but completely different rule set. This design is certainly dated in some elements. There are some very clunky aspects of the rules. The map design is 43 years old and is just someone got the bocage texture and coloured everything in bocage. That's one of the main criticisms levelled of this game. Is just the flood of bocage that the Allied players have to contend with. Look, I've been discussing over recent days the extent to which that is accurate. Even today, if you go to satellite maps of this terrain, there's bocage everywhere. So certainly there's scope in some areas to reduce the bocage. Someone pointed out that north of Caen there's a lot of farmland. I agree. So there's maybe scope to cut out some of the bocage from there. At the same time, the bocage provides the Germans with good defensive benefits, and in clear terrain, they struggle to defend. So that needs to be balanced. There needs to be a middle ground between bocage and defensive benefits. In this playthrough, it was very difficult for the Germans to dig in, to entrench and build improved positions. Their lines were always so desperately thin that they never had the spare troops. They always were throwing everything into the line. Engineers in the front line, every available infantry into the front line. An experienced German player might say, okay, I will break down these battalions into smaller companies, try to hold a thinly held line while some of these engineers get behind the lines and start building these entrenchments. But very early on, from the 7th of June, the situation seems so desperate for the Germans that they want to send everything to the line to hold these allies as they advance. And yeah, it's interesting as a monster game. It's taken me 2 weeks basically to play through this. The 6th of June itself took the better part of a week, just because there's so much to get worked through. But you learn these lessons from playing the game about entrenching, about where reinforcements could go, about where to defend and so forth. They're only learnt sort of in hindsight. 1 week into the campaign, you start to think, I should have defended there. I talk about this more in a separate sort of victory conditions, victory analysis video. 1 week into the campaign, I'm thinking, I should have held these engineers back to build some entrenchments, or held these units back to, do something else here. Or maybe kept some of the Panzer divisions as a sort of counter-strike force. Maybe I shouldn't have defended there and just pulled back to better defensive terrain. All these kind of things that you only really recognise in hindsight. So for that reason, look, you might argue that the game could benefit from repeated play. There's certainly value in having played the game, obviously, to go back and not repeat the same mistakes. Having said that, there are 4 turns in a day, and it feels like a very slow grind. Movement is very slow through this bocage. Armoured units move very slow through the bocage. Combat is tough for the Allies. I've mentioned in an earlier video that roughly 70 to 80% of their attacks fail. And they have to launch a lot of attacks, so that's a lot of odds calculation. It's a lot of armor shift calculation. It's a lot of artillery calculation and air support calculation. By the end, I wasn't even bothering with the naval bombardment because this is a lot to consider for one combat. And then when you're doing combats all along the line, it is a very, very slow, drawn-out process. I would prefer a simplification of the combat system because there's a lot to calculate for one combat. You work out combat odds, and then you work out armor shift. You work out defender's armor and how that's multiplied by terrain. So then you work out the multiplier for your armor shift and the column shift. And by the time you've worked that out, you've forgotten what the initial attack strength was or the initial defense strength was. So you've got to go back and remind yourself of that. There's so much to keep in your mind. It'd be really helpful to have a notepad here tracking all these odds and what you're doing. So yeah, combat. It's 43 years old. I would like it to be simplified. The weather is huge. So on clear turns, the Allies get, I don't know, 240 ground support units, more than that, 260 ground support strength through their air units to add to combat across the map, and that is massive. That is several divisions worth of combat strength. When there are heavy storms, they have none of that, and there's a huge difference. In this campaign, I think the weather balanced out. We had storms, which impact supply. I got lucky with the supply rolls on that turn. Then there's heavy weather. We had heavy overcast. We had light overcast, which halves that air value. And then we had, I think, 2 clear turns in the final 2 days to facilitate this American drive. When that weather is clear, there's no stopping the Allied attacks. They just can bring B-26s with potentially 14 combat strength just from air support. Which is massive. So I spoke about the map, the bocage. It has a big footprint. You can see the map rides up the edge of my table here. Luckily, I didn't have to rely on this at all. So this is where the Americans are. They're advanced off my plexi into Carteret. But keep that in mind. The smaller scenarios, I've played just a couple, and they were great. Fall of Cherbourg is a fascinating scenario, great learning experience. I played through the Omaha Beach invasion, and it taught me how difficult this is and how chaotic it is and how random it is. But I've heard good things about the other scenarios as well. So if you've got a smaller footprint table, certainly it's feasible. The counters are wafer thin and difficult to handle. My tweezers can't pick them up because they're so thin and fragile. So being mindful of that. If you really don't like thin, fragile counters, you may have trouble here. You've often got dense, tightly stacked, particularly around Con, stacks of counters. You've got a battalion plus maybe 2 companies. You've got artillery stacks, and you're constantly flipping these things over. You're constantly adding administrative counters. You may have noticed my table is sort of covered in all these administrative... They're all over the place. Out of communication, out of supply, demoralization, disorder, out of battery. These counters just end up all over the place. The Germans are often suffering a lot of company-level casualties, so these are being removed, and I'm trying to sort of throw them around. There are different ways you can approach this, obviously. You could take the very slow, cautious, steady study. I tend to play through things quickly. If you've seen the live videos. What else? It feels so heavily imbalanced towards the Allies. Again, one playthrough, so I don't really have several campaign playthroughs to give a sense of sort of broader perspective, but certainly my initial impression is that the Allies are hugely favoured and are unstoppable. I played this solo, and it wasn't the German experience didn't seem like much fun. The Germans are basically bringing on reinforcements, trying to put them in a good position, and then waiting to see what the Allies do. The Allies have these interior lines of communication, particularly the Americans around here, where they can shift these armoured forces along these roads. The German lines feel so fragile that they don't have that luxury. The Germans, like I said, they rush these reinforcements on, and so often these reinforcements are arriving. So many times, these German reinforcements are arriving just in time to plug this gap. On the last turn, these 353rd Division reinforcements arriving through Coutances to Marseille to hold the town just before the Americans can capture it. And that happened so many times, reinforcements arriving just in time. The 101st, was it the 9th Division, held Le Haye de Puix briefly, and then reinforcements came to recapture it. So it never felt that the Germans had any luxury, any freedom of movement, that they were always just holding on throughout the campaign until they couldn't hold on anymore around this area here in particular. For the most part, so much of every turn felt like siege warfare. It felt like you've got this... The Atlantic Wall refers to German defences along the coast, but this game really makes it feel like that wall is the line of German troops trying to prevent an Allied breakthrough. And it does feel like a brick wall that the Allies are just butting their heads against, relentlessly hoping for just that small crack to appear. When those small cracks do appear, they're important, and that's where the Allies advance. So there's sort of this, the idea of sometimes you have narrow, focused, intense attacks on a particular position. That's rare because of the sticky zones of control, mandatory attacks. If you bring in sort of units to attack, you have to attack every adjacent defender, and that forces you to attack sort of along the line. So you're often bringing in troops to satisfy those requirements to attack, which results in this sort of broad front offensive. It's just the way the rules are presented sort of pushes you towards that style of attacking. The idea of a concentrated, focused attack on a particular location occasionally happens, but it is relatively rare. So, you know, on the last turn of the game, I brought all these forces into Valence. I had basically surrounded on 3 sides. I was able to bring in forces on all sides to concentrate them on Valence, but that is rare to have that sort of isolation. So I guess the key question is, was this enjoyable? At times, I think I take broader value from sort of the story that develops. I'm more interested in the broader narrative of this campaign. Over the course of a week and a half, the Allies advanced, they captured Caen, advanced across the Canadian Peninsula. It's interesting to see this develop, but it develops so painfully slowly. I've done some live videos on this, and that shows you how long these turns can take. It certainly speeds up. By this stage, you know, you've got more focused Allied efforts, are much smoother with combat and so forth, so it does speed up, but it is long and big. It's grinding. It feels like this very, very slow grinding siege, which isn't a lot of fun to go through the mechanisms of. It's satisfying to look back and reflect and think, wow, this all happened. But yeah, going through the motions is laborious at times. When you have these American breakthroughs, that's exciting. When the Germans counterattack, very rarely, that's exciting. But 90% of this game is this static, slow, failing Allied attacks, and inability to move the line. It's just not a lot of fun, even for the German player. They form a line, the Allies attack, they all become demoralised. It's a lot of flipping of counters, a lot of calculating of odds for nothing to happen, and that's not really great. Not a good gaming experience, I guess I'll say. So, yeah, for that reason, I think you've got to be very patient to play this. You have to be very patient. I don't think I would ever play this again. I mentioned that it kind of there's replay value, certainly if you want to learn lessons from this and run through it again. But the burden of the slow progress is I guess too much for me. Not enough happens for me to want to invest another 2 weeks. I think it's taking me to play through this, to play through a game. And look, all the time I'm playing this, I'm thinking I'd rather be playing GTS The Greatest Day, which is far smaller scale, but so much more is happening. What I love about GTS is there's always stuff happening in most scenarios. I think back to the Saga of the Sixth Airborne, which I played through on The Greatest Day, and that was like a siege situation, and that wasn't much fun. And the feeling of playing the Saga of the Sixth Airborne, of having these Allied defences and the Germans trying to attack against it, was kind of reminiscent. This game evokes a similar feeling of this German brick wall and the Americans trying to butt against it and not much happening. And yeah, I guess I'm realising that I don't really like those types of static siege type situations. I prefer, when I played the Ardennes Offensive last year, I preferred that type of game where there's movement, things are happening, and you're actually moving troops and making decisions. Both sides are making important decisions. Even the American player on the defensive in the Ardennes Offensive by Mark Simonich, Ardennes 44. You're making decisions. The Americans are making critical decisions about where to defend and how to defend and so forth. The decisions the German player is making here is often very obvious. Oh my goodness, the Germans have just opened a gap here. I'll put reinforcements there, wait and see what happens next. Yeah. What else can I comment on to kind of inform your understanding of this game? Look, 43 years old, map, counters. It can be difficult to see. Very small font, difficult to read the counters. So if that's an issue for you, something to be mindful of. Very flimsy counters, very thin. 2,000 counters, so a lot to manage. Break your counters when you're organising your counters. Break them down to divisions and store them separately so they don't get mixed up. Look, certainly an ahistorical Allied advantage. They just are going to drive through that clear terrain. They are going to exploit the open information, basically, for their advantage. And the Germans just don't have the numbers. The Allies just have superiority of forces, and they can grind the Germans down. Knowing this again, I should have been more relentless in my attacks. I could have been attacking all along the lines wherever I had supply. Should have done so because, I mean, these Allied reinforcements keep coming on. When the Germans get reinforcements, they get a handful of battalions, which isn't enough to make up for their losses. But again, it's reflecting on this. It's an interesting experience of the Normandy campaign at this battalion company level. The level of detail has been quite interesting. I would love to see this move a little bit faster. I'd love to see the combat system streamlined, simpler, in other words. Somehow find a way to incorporate armor shifts more smoothly. Artillery is interesting, but I'm not a fan of the final protective fire rules. It's just another sort of calculation to make. Headquarters, I get, again, this is a criticism of a 43-year-old game. So headquarters, I understand the need to have these supply rules, but there were never really any issues with supply. They kind of just another little thing to have to manage. They can move so rapidly. They're always supplying their forces. It's really only when units become isolated completely. And I think this is why subsequent games sort of in the 80s and 90s just simplified the supply rules to say, draw a supply to your line of the map. There's no need to have all these separate headquarters counters that you're managing. I guess it's a way to track replacements. That was an element of gameplay. What else can I comment on? So yeah, combat system frustrating. Blockage rules interesting, but easily overcome. Basically, when the Allies went to combat, they can advance into blockage. And if the Germans subsequently withdraw from that zone of control, they place a delay marker. The Allies can overcome that and circumvent that rule simply by not advancing. If the Germans want to move back into that space, the Germans have to attack the Allies, which they typically don't want to do because they're weaker. So the Americans, or the Allies, just don't advance. The Germans don't move into that hex. And on the next Allied turn, the Allies can move into that vacated space and attack again. Thus, there's no delay marker. There are fewer German units, and they can still advance. So it took me a while to figure this out, and then I realized, well, just don't advance. If the Germans want to move back into that space, they have to attack me. Whenever the Germans counterattacked, 99 times out of 100, they were unsuccessful. So the whole blockage delay was just frustrating and annoying. What are the other key elements? Airborne landings were interesting. The scatter creates the chaos and uncertainty, which created some very interesting situations around Carentan, out on Pegasus Bridge, the Orne River. The whole naval invasion sequence was horrific, long and random and chaotic, and coming down to rolling hundreds, if not thousands, of dice to make an outcome. Now, you might say, oh, well, surely the odds all work out. Not every die roll is of equal significance. Your die rolls, your LCTR attacks on strongholds are the most important die rolls, and you only get, on Omaha Beach, 4, 5, 6 of these die rolls. They are the most important die rolls of the entire game. If your LCTR rocket attacks on these German strong points fail, you may not open a gap on Omaha. The whole beach may fail. For the whole campaign, for this monster game with 2,000 counters, to kind of come down to these critical die rolls is deeply unsettling. The weather roll on the second day, if that is storms, and if you roll badly for supply, it's I don't want to say game over, but it's pretty close to game over for the Allies. They'll get no air support, they'll get no supplies, they won't be able to attack. Happy birthday to the 21st Panzer Division. They'll be running riot along the beaches. All this comes down not to the decisions you've made, but these critical die rolls. So whilst you're rolling thousands of buckets of dice for every landing infantry, every tank, every engineer, and then demolition points along all the beaches, whilst you're doing this 3 times each game turn over the first day, of 3 or 4 turns of the first day, it's all, like I said, it all comes down to those most important critical roles. So yeah, look, it's a huge time investment for those critical things of weather and LCTRs and supply to kind of determine what you can do and how yeah, look, maybe it all balanced out, fortunately, in this playthrough, as I said, with the weather, but it's a huge risk to take in investing so much time into this game. Okay, folks, so to wrap it up, look, this has been an interesting experience, at times enjoyable, but the moments of enjoyment have come, as I said, when things have moved, when the 9th and the 79th and the 90th Division were driving across the Potemkin Peninsula. This was one of the most interesting elements of the game. The kind of siege situation around Eversey, the slow grind of the 50th Division, that was not particularly fun or interesting. I can reflect and think yeah, it is what it is, I guess. Yeah, I would still recommend this game if you're a very, very patient gamer. It's certainly playable. I would not recommend it multiplayer. I've been having this discussion. I would hate to be the German player against an opponent. Pointless, sitting around, not doing much. The Allies, have all the agency and control, and you are just sitting back and waiting to see what they do. This is why I say this is a better solo game than it is multiplayer. The chaos of that initial invasion. If you're playing 2-player and you roll storms on the second turn, it's not going to be fun for the Americans. But as a solo, just story-oriented game, if you kind of put aside the historical kind of allied advantage and say, look, this is just a game. I'm going to play out the Normandy campaign and see what happens. I think that's probably the healthiest way to approach this, rather than treating this as a strict historical treatment of events. I pointed out in my sort of most recent videos sort of how it wasn't too far from the historical narrative, but yeah, it's certainly off the rails. So yeah, there it is. That's Atlantic War, SPI, 1978. There are still many copies in circulation, so you can find a copy of this if it's of interest. If you are interested in this, but you don't want this particular game, consider G&T's Battle for Normandy, published a couple of years ago, but on P500 right now. There's also Decision Games' redesign of this, Atlantic War, published a couple of years ago. But again, the rules for that are much more complex compared to this. What else is there? Battle for Normandy. Look, the Grand Tactical Series. Much more detailed. I would argue the rules are of a similar complexity. There's probably more rules in the Grand Tactical Series, but there's kind of still this learning curve, but they're easier to implement. So the naval sequence of play is complex, but what I love about that naval sequence of play is you have control. So for more detail, for more granularity, consider The Greatest Day. There are forthcoming sequels focusing on other aspects of the Normandy campaign. I'm sure there's more, but they're the ones that come to mind for this big, broad scale. Battle for Normandy, Atlantic War from Decision Games. And I'm sure you could probably suggest some. Post in the comments if you can think of some that I haven't mentioned. Yeah. Hopefully, again, folks, that's been informative. That is Atlantic War. Have at it what you will. Thanks, everyone.